They always said I had good hands. That's what Uncle Ray called it, patting me on the back like I was some well-trained pet. Emma's the kind of girl who can fix a jet engine but still bake a pie. That's balance, folks. And people would laugh, like it was a compliment, like being practical was all a woman needed to be. I was 16 the first time I rebuilt a fuel injection system by myself. 16 and already dreaming in torque specs and pressure ratios. My name's Emma Whitmore. I was the girl with engine oil on her sleeves and aerospace journals under her pillow. And someday I'd become a mechanical engineer for the United States Air Force, not because someone handed me the blueprint, but because I learned to build it from scratch. Chase, my older brother, had just started flight school, and everyone acted like we had a real-life Top Gun in the family. Every meal, every conversation somehow came back to Chase. Meanwhile, I was in the garage elbow deep in steel and grease, holding engines together like I was holding together my sanity. My dad loved Chase in a loud way, boisterous, proud, always introducing him to neighbours, like he was the second coming of Charles Lindbergh. With me, it was the quiet approval, if you could even call it that. A nod, a mention when it helped his image. My daughters in engineering, he'd say then pivot to Chase's flight hours like I was just a footnote. Mum was softer, but no different. Emma's good with her hands, she told a neighbour once, but Chase, oh Chase, sees the sky. Like hands weren't enough. Like holding the sky together wasn't just as sacred as flying through it. And then there was Caleb, my cousin. Quiet, sweet, always clutching a physics book or something weird from the library. We were the background kids, the ones who stayed behind while the family gathered around the golden boy. Caleb and I used to sit on the back porch and take apart old radios, pretending we were decrypting secret missions. He was the only one who noticed when I stopped smiling so much, the only one who stayed when Chase flew off to glory and leaving behind a house that only spoke the language of medals and uniforms. Caleb never raised his voice, never defended me when people made their little jokes. But he'd sit beside me, hand me the wrench I needed without asking. Sometimes I wondered if that quiet loyalty was better than any words. At 19, I joined the Air Force as a mechanical engineer. I still remember the stiffness of that first uniform, the way it hugged my shoulders, the way my boots echoed too loudly down the hangar halls. I came home that Christmas, thinking maybe now they'd see me differently, that maybe I'd get to be more than the girl who held the flashlight while Chase did the talking. But nothing had changed. That Christmas dinner was louder than usual. Dad had invited a few friends from his old unit guys, who still called him Cap, and swapped stories like they were still 25 and in uniform. Mom set the table with the good dishes, and Chase brought home a girl no one bothered to introduce me to. It was one of those nights where everyone seemed to fit into some polished version of who they were supposed to be. One of Dad's friends from his old unit, Mr. Kirkland, red-faced from too much wine and too little tact, raised his glass and chuckled. "So, Emma, you're still fixing planes, huh?" "Well, better that than crashing them, I guess." Laughter rippled down the table light and easy, like he'd said something harmless. My fork hovered mid-air, my stomach dropped. "I'm not fixing toasters," I wanted to say. "I'm keeping aircraft in the sky," but I didn't. I just swallowed my pride along with my bite of green bean casserole. Then Aunt Shelley chimed in with a smirk. "You know, if you ever get tired of the wrench, you could open a bakery. Those hands, they're made for kneading dough, not holding tools." Again laughter, bigger this time. I wanted to disappear into the napkin on my lap. But I sat through it, like I always had. Across the table, Caleb caught my eye for a second, his face taut like someone trying to breathe in a room without air. He didn't say a word, but he didn't laugh either. And somehow, that mattered. Uncle Ray leaned across the table and said, "Well, Emma, you're still the only girl I know who can twist a bolt like a man. Just don't forget to smile." And everyone laughed again. That night, I sat in the garage, same old place, same smell of oil and rust and silence. I looked at my hands. the same ones that had just completed an aircraft inspection on base that week. The same ones that would one day, though no one knew it yet, save hundreds of lives. But back then, they were just good hands. And I was just the girl who knew how to use them. Nothing more. Not in their eyes. And Caleb, he came out with 2 mugs of tea sat beside me on the concrete. He didn't say anything, just tapped his foot gently in rhythm with mine. Like he understood. Like he'd always understood. Uncle Ray's joke wasn't just a joke. It became a catchphrase in our house. Good hands, Emma, they'd say whenever something broke, a coffee machine, a lamp, the back gate. Call Emma, she'll fix it. And I always did. No one ever asked if I wanted to. It was expected, like setting the table or saying grace. The tools in our garage were older than I, and I knew them like names in a family Bible. My favourite was a torque wrench my grandfather used in Vietnam. It had a hairline crack on the handle like a scar from some old war, and I swore it made the best tension reads. Every time I used it, I felt like I was tightening more than bolts, like I was holding together a legacy that no one thought I was worthy of. When I was 10, Chase got his first model plane kit. Mom helped him paint it red and white, and he hung it from his ceiling with fishing line. When I asked for one too, Dad handed me a toolkit instead and said, "Here you can help Chase assemble his." I remember staring at the box, watching my brother unwrap his wings while I unwrapped socket heads. "Girls don't fly, sweetheart," Mom added gently as if kindness softened the blow. "But you've always been good at helping." That word helping followed me like a shadow. I didn't want to help. I wanted to build, to fly, to matter. By middle school, I was the weird kid who spent lunch hours in the robotics lab, while Chase got stopped in the hallway by teachers saying, "You're going places, young man." He did. And every postcard from every base he landed at was a reminder of the miles between us. Not just physical ones, emotional too. I wrote him letters. He never wrote back. I graduated top of my class in engineering, but at the dinner celebration, Dad made a toast to Emma, who somehow managed to make nuts and bolts elegant. Everyone laughed. I didn't. I felt like a wrench useful cold and always kept in a drawer until someone else needed the glory. Caleb wasn't at that dinner. He'd started community college by then studying environmental science, something he said made him feel useful without needing to be loud. He understood what it was like to be overlooked. We talked often, always quietly. Our family wasn't made for quiet people. It was built for uniforms and noise and high ranks. We were the soft background, the ones who clapped for the speeches but never gave them. When I got commissioned, I called Caleb before I called my parents. He said, "You're going to change everything, Em." I believed him for about a week, until I came home and Mum said, "That's nice, honey. Your brother's being considered for test pilot school." I nodded, smiled, said the right things, then went upstairs and unpacked my medals in silence. It was around then that I realised being invisible isn't the worst thing. It's being visible only when you're convenient, when your worth is only as loud as the silence you maintain. One time, the base hosted a family day. We gave tours of our hangars, showed off engine work. I walked my parents through my station, proud to show them the jet I'd just completed an overhaul on. My dad barely glanced up. "That's a big one," he said, more impressed by its size than the weeks I'd spent making sure it could fly. Later, I overheard him telling someone my son flies jets like these. Never once mentioned that his daughter made sure they didn't fall apart. That was the day I stopped expecting them to see me, and I started building a different kind of strength, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need applause to keep moving. And Caleb, he sent me a postcard that week. It just said, "Machines don't talk, but they remember who held them together." I kept it in my locker, tucked behind my ID tag where no one could see it, but I knew it was there, and sometimes that was enough. Growing up in a military family felt like living inside a war memorial, every wall lined with plaques, every conversation a reenactment of glory. We didn't talk about feelings. We saluted them, buried them, or brushed them off with a nod. Our house in Fayetteville had photos of Dad in dress blues of Mom, in fatigues of Chase in a cockpit mid-lift-off. If there were any pictures of me, they were tucked behind refrigerator magnets or cropped out unintentionally. No one meant to erase me. They just didn't notice I was there. The Walshes didn't make space for stillness, and I was the stillness in a house that worshipped motion. Chase was the prototype tall square-jawed, the kind of man who looked good in sunglasses and made eye contact like a bullet. He didn't just fly planes. He became a symbol of masculinity, of success, of what our family pointed to when they wanted to say, "This is what we're about." I remember one 4th of July, the whole neighbourhood gathered for the annual barbecue. Dad grilled Chase wore his flight suit, even though he wasn't on duty, and I, home from ROTC training, was asked to hand out napkins. "Let the pilot rest," Aunt Shelley said, winking. "He protects the skies." I protect the engines that keep him up there, I thought, but smiled anyway. When the family took a group photo that evening, they called me over only after the picture was snapped. "We'll get another one with you in it," someone promised. They never did. At Christmas, my name was on the tag, but never in the toast. I gave practical gifts headlamps, multi-tools, base layer thermals. Chase gave framed photos of him, flying over desert ranges, signed like he was some hometown celebrity. Mum would tear up. Dad would slap his back and say, "That's my boy." Caleb and I used to make paper gliders in the corner, watching like spectators at a show we never auditioned for. He was my only real refuge back then. Caleb didn't shine the way Chase did. He flickered, soft, curious, the kind of kid who asked how things worked just to feel close to them. We used to take apart broken toasters, clock radios, even Mum's old cassette player when we were sure she wouldn't miss it. He once told me machines are kinder than people. They only break when something's wrong. I think that's why we both loved them. They didn't lie, didn't ignore, didn't forget you were there. Caleb had this way of making the silence between us feel like companionship instead of emptiness. We didn't need words. He'd hand me a screwdriver before I asked. I'd test his circuits before he double-checked them. We were a team. And yet, as we got older, Caleb got quieter. When relatives mocked me at dinners, he looked down at his plate. When Chase was praised, Caleb clapped with everyone else. Not out of agreement, out of survival. One day, when I asked why he never said anything, he shrugged. They don't listen to people like us, Em. They listen to volume, not value. It gutted me, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. In a house full of brass and bravado, his softness was seen as weakness. Mine was seen as irrelevant. And so he stayed silent. Not because he didn't care, but because speaking up would have cost him the little peace he had. In our family, the louder you were, the more real you became. And Caleb and I, we were whispers in a house built to echo. There were roles in our family the way there were ranks in the military, assigned, never questioned. Chase was the leader, Dad the commander, Mum the keeper of quiet dignity. Caleb was the observer. And me, I was the technician, the fixer, the one who made things work but wasn't allowed to take credit when they did. Every holiday had its script. At Thanksgiving, Chase carved the turkey. I folded napkins into perfect triangles and was told, "You're so handy." At Easter, Chase led the family prayer. I refilled the deviled egg tray. 4th of July, he gave speeches. I checked the wires on the speakers. And no one thought any of it was wrong. Because that was how it had always been. You didn't rewrite tradition. You reinforced it. I remember one Veterans Day when I was 12. Our school held a parade and families with military ties were asked to participate. Chase 16 then wore Dad's old cap and walked proudly out front with a cardboard jet strapped to his shoulders like wings. The crowd clapped like he'd flown in from war. I had asked to carry a sign with our family name, maybe say something during the tribute. Mom patted my head and said, "Let your brother have his moment, sweetheart." I ended up holding the extra water bottles for the marching band. No one even noticed I was there until the end when someone asked me to collect the trash. That night, Chase's picture was on the school newsletter. I was in the background, half blurred, bending down to pick up an empty soda can. Later, I found Caleb sitting on the curb outside his house, playing with a broken wristwatch. "We don't get parades, huh?" I said. He smiled soft and resigned. "We get gears and wires. They last longer anyway." That was the thing about Caleb. He never fought for the spotlight, but he knew how to make the shadows feel like home. We didn't talk about our disappointment. We just made things, machines, stories, spaces where we were seen by each other if no one else. Sometimes I wondered if we were broken for not wanting what Chase had, but deep down I knew we just wanted to be enough without having to be loud, without needing to fly to be free. At the base, I kept my head down and my hands moving. The Polaris project wasn't something most people even knew existed. Classified, high risk, high tech. A tight-knit circle of engineers working on next-generation jet propulsion systems, where every adjustment could mean the difference between breaking the sound barrier or breaking apart mid-air. I was one of the youngest in the room, often the only woman, and definitely the only one who still fixed her own car in the base parking lot. But I earned my place. Not through bravado, but through precision. Through long hours running simulations, inspecting minute anomalies in fuel pressure feedback loops, and noticing microscopic wear in turbine blades. My name wasn't on the memos, not even in the footnotes, but my fingerprints were everywhere. My CO once said, "Whitmore, you're the only one who makes this whole damn puzzle hold together." And yet, during briefings with brass, they skipped my seat. Eyes passed over me like I was part of the furniture. The ghost in the flight log. Back home, the pattern continued. During a family reunion, Dad raised a glass. To the brave ones in the sky who faced danger head-on. Everyone cheered. Chase winked. I sat there, swirling the ice in my untouched drink. Caleb leaned in and whispered, "You keep those brave ones alive." I smiled small, almost grateful. But even his whisper felt too soft against the roar of a family that celebrated only what soared. Polaris had its moments, late nights in hangars that smelled of heat and steel, the way machine oil clung to your clothes like a second skin. Once we caught a pressure irregularity in an F-28 prototype. Minor on paper, devastating in reality. I flagged it. Fought for a pause. The commander pushed back. "We can't afford delays." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You can't afford dead pilots." There was a beat of silence. Then, a nod. Test postponed. Months later, after reconfigurations, we discovered a fracture in the combustion, housing a defect that would have torn the jet apart in midair. The official report cited routine procedural audit. No names, no commendations, just the machine saved, not the mechanic. When Mum invited me to a 4th of July BBQ that year, I almost didn't go. But Caleb texted, "Come. I'll be there." And so I showed up uniform, crisp boots, clean. Chase was already holding court in the backyard, surrounded by neighbours and distant cousins. "That's the man who flew recon in Operation Iron Halo," Dad beamed. I stood quietly near the drink table. One woman asked if I was Chase's assistant. "No," I said. "I'm his sister, and I outrank him." Her eyes blinked in surprise, then slid away. The conversation moved on. Like I was a speed bump they didn't expect on the road to admiration. That night, Chase gave a little toast. To the ones who take risks, who fly into the unknown. Dad clapped. Mum dabbed her eyes. "Caleb." He looked at me across the yard, eyes tight, jaw clenched like it hurt to stay silent. But he stayed that way. Silent, as always. The next day, a new test flight was greenlit. I was back in my element tools, diagnostics checklists, and silence. My name wasn't said, my work wasn't praised. But I knew what I did. I knew what I was worth. Even if no one said it aloud. One afternoon, while replacing a faulty throttle valve in one of the test jets, a young pilot walked in, probably fresh out of flight school aviators still too big for his face. He looked at me, crouched under the wing, oil-stained uniform talk, wrench in hand, and said, half joking, didn't know the cleaning crew worked on engines now. I stood up slowly, eyes meeting his. Didn't know flyboys skipped diagnostics. 1 to engines are 1, I said flatly, tossing the faulty valve into his palm. This would have cost you altitude in 30 seconds. He blinked, mumbled something and walked away. That kind of interaction wasn't rare. It was routine. Like my competence was only visible in hindsight, usually after I saved someone's ass. Back home, Chase got a medal. A big one. Operation Night Wake. The whole town came out. Red, white, and blue banners. Speeches. A brass band. I was asked to handle photos for the base newsletter. I stood there, with the camera capturing his grin, the colonel's handshake, the crowd's applause. He never once looked at me. Not even when I said, "Great shot." I packed up my gear while they served cake with Chase's face on it. When I got home, I opened the fridge. Same cake untouched. Mum said, "We saved you a piece." I didn't eat it. That night, Caleb called. He'd seen the news clip. "You got that valve out just in time, didn't you?" I didn't need to answer. He already knew. The thing is, there's a kind of strength. No one trains you for the kind where you keep doing the right thing even when no one's clapping. It's the silence after the storm, when the engines hold when the metal doesn't give. That silence is where I lived, where I became more than a name in a file. I became the reason others came home. It happened on a Thursday. A heat wave clung to the base like it had something to prove. I was in Hangar 6 going through a final round of inspections for the Polaris fleet. The next day, 6 F-28s were scheduled for high-altitude recon drills. Routine, but routine's where danger hides when people stop looking. I approached Jet 44 just like the others, but something about it felt tight, off. I crouched, ran my palm over the fuselage, then climbed up to access the intake port. When I tapped the regulator mount with a torque rod, the echo came back, wrong. Too soft, too hollow. Machines speak if you know how to listen. I took it apart, piece by piece. Coolant lines, compressor rings, tension flaps until I saw it. A fissure. Barely a line, but it ran across the edge of the pressure housing like a crack through ice. It was a fracture in a part that never fractured. Not unless the alloy was wrong. Not unless someone cut corners upstream. I reported it immediately. Lieutenant Hall, the supervising officer, looked at the data and frowned. "Diagnostics don't show any pressure faults," he said. "Could be a sensor lag." I kept my voice even. "It's not the sensors. It's the metal. This jet goes up, it won't come down in one piece." He looked at me like I'd just told him the sky was falling. "You want to delay 6 flights over a gut feeling?" "It's not a gut," I snapped. "It's a crack, real, physical. And if it's here, it could be in the others." There was a pause. One of the engineers behind me muttered something under his breath. Probably drama queen. I didn't care. Hall finally sighed and said, "We'll run full diagnostics. But if this turns up clean, it's your ass on the line." "Better mine than a pilot's coffin," I replied, and walked away before I said something I couldn't take back. The next 8 hours were chaos. I coordinated a full inspection of every aircraft in the Polaris fleet. We scanned, tested, and disassembled. The hangars buzzed with tension tools clanging like warning bells. Around midnight, Jet 47 showed the same crack. Then, Jet 39. 3 out of 6. Same fracture line, same manufacturing batch. If even one had flown, we'd be looking at a body count, not a delay. Lieutenant Hall didn't look at me when he said good call. That was his version of a medal. The official report, one-line anomaly, detected via early detection protocol. Flights delayed per safety regulation. That was it. No names, no thanks. Just a machine saved, not the mechanic. Later in the locker room, I overheard 2 pilots complaining. Some engineer pulled the plug, probably overreacting. Another chimed in, hope she's happy making us look like cowards. I almost turned around. Almost. But then the third voice said, yeah, well, at least we're alive. And that shut them up. I sat on the bench untying my boots and noticed a small smear of oil on my wrist. I didn't wipe it off. It felt like armour. Back in my quarters, I checked my phone. 1 message. Caleb. Just 6 words. I know it was you, M. I stared at the screen for a long time, then placed the phone on my chest and lay back, eyes closed. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like something trying to get in. Or maybe trying to get out. The next morning I passed Lieutenant Hall in the corridor. He nodded. We replaced the whole batch. Good call. I didn't answer, just kept walking. Behind me, I heard him say, softly, almost like an afterthought, hell of a pair of eyes, Whitmore. That was the closest thing I ever got to recognition. Sometimes, the bolt that doesn't lie is the one no one wants to see. A week later, I was back home carrying a lemon cake in one hand and a bottle of red in the other, standing in front of the old screen door that always stuck a little in the summer humidity. It was Mum's 60th. I hadn't been home since Easter, not really, not emotionally. I told myself it was a duty. The truth was, it hurt less to miss them than to be missed by no one. Inside the house was buzzing. Chase was already mid-sentence when I stepped in. He always was telling some animated story to a circle of uncles and neighbours. So the whole squad's grounded, he said, pacing a little like he was still in the cockpit, because some overzealous engineer thought a ghost in the engine was going to kill us all. 2 full days, grounded. Can you believe it? The men around him burst into laughter. Someone slapped his back. Engineers, Uncle Ray chuckled. Paranoid little mechanics. I hovered near the doorway, invisible and entirely too present. I could feel Caleb's eyes find me from across the room. He was standing by the fireplace holding a soda, like it might explain his silence. Then Mum's voice floated in from the kitchen. Well, Emma's always been careful. Sometimes a little too careful. Slows things down, bless her heart. She said it like a joke wrapped in concern, like a compliment that didn't want to commit. But she means well. That was the slice that cut the deepest. She means well. That phrase used on toddlers and dogs who chew shoes. Not a woman who had saved 6 pilots from a faulty engine casing. Not a lieutenant colonel who signed off on safety memos that saved lives. But no one here knew that. No one had asked. I walked in, careful not to let the cake tilt, set it gently on the counter next to Chase's girlfriend's gift basket, wrapped in gold foil, topped with a ribbon big enough to crown a parade float. Emma Mom said you remembered the cake. You've always been good with details. She smiled, then turned back to the oven. Details, not heart, not brilliance, just details. Dinner was roast chicken, green bean casserole and mashed potatoes. Classic, predictable. Everyone dug in. Between bites and laughter, someone asked Chase about test pilot school. He shrugged modestly. They're considering me. There's talk of a prototype program. Classified stuff. He's the real deal, Dad said. Born for the sky. Built for it, someone added. I chewed slowly my fork a metronome for everything I didn't say. Then, Chase, with that grin of his, said, just glad we didn't have to rely on someone like Emma to fix the wings mid-air right. A few chuckles low and polite. You just tell us to wait until the problem goes away. That one stung because it was half true. Waiting is what I'd learned to do in this house. I caught Caleb's eyes again. He looked down quickly, his hands clenched around the napkin on his lap. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't laugh, but he didn't speak either. And somehow that was worse, because I knew he knew. After dinner, we gathered around the cake. Chase led the song. Mum beamed like the candles were medals and she'd earned every one. Afterward, I handed her the gift. I'd brought a framed photo I'd restored of her and Dad in uniform from the 80s. She blinked at it, then said, "Oh, I forgot this picture even existed. Chase, come see. You have his smile?" He didn't, but she needed to believe it. As I was getting ready to leave, Caleb slipped something into my coat pocket. We didn't hug, our family didn't do that. But his hand brushed mine. It stayed a second too long, like an apology he didn't know how to give. I got in the car, drove 2 blocks, then pulled over under a busted streetlight. I reached into my pocket and unfolded the napkin. His handwriting, small and neat, read, "She was right. Just that. No name, no signature, no sorry." But it was more than anyone else had ever given me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Mum's voice. She means well. I replayed it like a voicemail I couldn't delete. I thought of all the birthdays I'd spent building things, airplane kits, engine mods, small fixes no one noticed. The year I gave Mum a homemade jewellery box and she said, "Oh, honey, Chase gave me perfume." That was when I stopped making things for people. Funny how cuts from paper and people you love leave the deepest scars. A week later, I got the email. The subject line was clinical, as if it were informing me about a software update, promotion approval, Lieutenant Colonel Emma Whitmore. No bold font, no signature in blue ink. Just a PDF attached like a receipt for something I forgot I ordered. I stared at the screen blinking. There was no call from command, no knock on my office door, no formation waiting in the sun. Just a box in my inbox and silence. I opened the PDF. There it was. My name, my new rank, Lieutenant Colonel. For a split second, I felt like my heart was trying to catch up with the room. Then it passed. No one cheered, no trumpet sounded. Just the same fluorescent light buzzing overhead and the thrum of the HVAC as my only witnesses. I printed the certificate anyway. Not for pride, maybe out of defiance. I held the paper in my hands. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of all the times I wasn't supposed to get here. Then, I slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk underneath a pile of unfinished service manuals and a torque calibration sheet. It landed with a soft shuffle. Just paper, after all. The next day on base, I walked into the hangar. No one said a word. I wasn't expecting a marching band, but a nod, maybe. A "hey, congrats," nothing. My team, a group of solid techs I respected, glanced my way and returned to their screens and checklists. It's not that they didn't care. It's that they'd learned not to speak too loudly in a system that didn't reward the quiet kind. Later that afternoon, I emailed Caleb. No subject line, just the scan. One line. Not much of a party, but thought you should know. He responded 10 minutes later. Be home tonight. That evening, just as the streetlights blinked on, Caleb knocked on my door holding a folded piece of printer paper. He stepped inside like he always did, careful not to make noise like he didn't want to wake the world. This came through, he said, lifting the paper. He'd printed the certificate I sent him, didn't want to forget it. Then he looked around my small living room and pointed at the blank space above my bookshelf. Mind if I nodded, not trusting my voice. He took 4 strips of tape from his backpack. Caleb always had tape bookmarks, string odds and ends, and smoothed the paper onto the wall. It crinkled slightly at the corners, but held firm. There, it was my name, my rank. On display, finally, if only in a room no one else visited. You could have framed it, I said, half laughing. I could have, he replied, but this felt more honest. We sat on the couch sipping tea that had gone cold in our hands. The room was quiet, save for the low tick of my old wall clock. "They'll never say it," he murmured. "But you earned that, every inch of it, I know," I said. And for once, I actually did. I thought about all the ceremonies I'd attended for others, the ones with polished boots and polished speeches, the ones where Chase stood front and centre, and I stood in the back clapping. I remembered how Dad used to shake hands like they were handing out destiny. How Mom cried when Chase got his captain's bars, how she set his framed photo on the mantel like a shrine. And I remembered the day I made my first solo repair on a failing hydraulic system and told no one because I knew no one would ask. Now, I had my own title, but no one was coming over for cake. There were no flowers. Just Caleb, my couch, and a printed sheet of paper held to drywall by tape and quiet love. He stayed for a while that night. We didn't talk much more. Before leaving, he looked back at the certificate. "Do you want me to frame it?" he asked. "No," I whispered. "This is better." After he left, I sat alone for a long time. I looked at the paper on the wall. It fluttered a little with the breeze from the vent, like it was breathing, like it was alive in ways a medal never could be. Some people get applause, others get promoted in the dark. But sometimes, if you're lucky, someone brings the light in with them and leaves it behind, even if it's just with printer paper and a roll of tape. 2 nights later, a cream-coloured envelope arrived at my on-base housing unit. The name on it wasn't mine, not exactly. It read, "Guest of Captain Chase Whitmore." No rank, no mention of my own service. Inside was a gilded invitation to a black-tie gala honouring exceptional service and valour in aerial operations. Chase, of course, was the centrepiece. A feature-length programme written like a love letter to high-altitude heroics. I almost threw it away. But Caleb texted an hour later. "You going to the big event? I got a ticket too. Thought, maybe we could sit together." I didn't have the heart to say no. So I pulled out my dress blues, ironed the pleats and pinned every ribbon and bar in regulation order. My shoes shone so well, I could see my face in them, tired, resolute, quietly daring myself to show up. It felt like putting on armour for a war no one acknowledged. The ballroom shimmered with brass and glass chandeliers, gold-framed portraits of generals and pillars dressed in red, white and blue sashes. People milled about in polished uniforms and silk gowns. Name tags read like resumes, "Lieutenant General this, Commander that." Mine was blank, a white square. Caleb raised his eyebrows when he saw it, but didn't say a word. He just nodded toward the back row of the seating chart. "Row F, let's go." We slid into our seats just as the national anthem finished. The lights dimmed. A slideshow of Chase began on a massive screened photos of him in aviator glasses, grinning in cockpits, saluting on tarmacs with the sun behind him, like some deity of speed and metal. My name was never mentioned. When the MC introduced Chase, he bounded up like he belonged in the spotlight. Maybe he did. The room loved him. He cleared his throat and said, "Flying is a privilege, and every time I take off, I do it knowing there's a team keeping me in the sky. Maintenance, mechanics, engineers, unsung heroes." My heart clenched. "They make sure our wings don't fail," he continued, "and they rarely get credit. So tonight, I want to say thank you to all those working behind the scenes." He never said my name. He looked over the audience, his gaze skimming the front rows where the brass sat, then to the side tables, then to the back. Our eyes met for a heartbeat. He blinked, gave a nod so slight it could have been a muscle twitch, then turned away. The room erupted in applause. I sat still. So did Caleb. The clapping rose and fell like a tide I wasn't invited into. The speech moved on. Other awards were given, other names were called. During dessert, a man from Chase's squadron stopped at our table. "Family of the guest of honor?" he asked. I nodded. He smiled at Caleb. "You must be the brother." Caleb shook his head. "Cousin." The man turned to me. "And you?" I didn't answer. I let the silence do the talking. He waited too long, awkwardness stretching between us like pulled thread. "Well," he said finally, "your brother's a damn fine pilot." "I know," I said, and turned away. Later, after the tables had been cleared and people began mingling, I wandered toward the exhibit hallway where portraits of decorated pilots lined the walls. In one frame, Chase stood beside a general holding a commendation. At the bottom, "Excellence in combat readiness." Caleb joined me. "Did you see the footnote?" he asked. I squinted. Under the plaque in small print, "Aircraft maintained by 4th Technical Division." That was my unit, my hands, my bolts, my sweat, but no name. We walked out together, the cool air biting at our collars. Caleb broke the silence first. I wanted to stand up, he said. When he said technical teams, I wanted to yell your name. I looked at him, his jaw tight fists in his pockets. "But I didn't," he added. I froze. "I know," I whispered. "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "You came. You sat with me. That's more than most." As we walked across the parking lot, a gust of wind caught my ribbon bar and rattled it. I pressed it down gently. "It's strange," I said. "They cheer for wings, but never for the bones that keep them from breaking." Caleb reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I printed this from the ceremony's online program," he said. "It doesn't have your name, but I wrote it in." He showed me next to Chase's name in careful handwriting he'd added, "Maintained by Lieutenant Colonel Emma Whitmore." I took the paper, smoothed the crease. "Thank you," I said. We stood there a while under the street lamp's hum. Just two people in uniform shadows rewriting the program in a language only we could hear. We stood outside the conference room as officers filed out chattering about logistics numbers and the next mission schedule. No one paid attention to the quiet moment that had cracked something wide open just minutes earlier. A young pilot, barely 25, face still holding that brand of reckless hope only new flyers had shared his story. Not with flair, not for drama, just quietly, like someone finally setting a stone down. "I didn't think I'd make it back that night," he said. I heard later, someone in engineering caught a systems flaw, a bolt issue, a tiny one deep inside. I don't know who, but whoever it was, they saved me. Silence followed his words, like dust settling after a hard landing. Nobody spoke. The room just shifted slightly, like the air itself understood something the people inside hadn't fully processed. I didn't say a word. I never did. Caleb, standing near the back, glanced sideways toward me, then leaned just a little closer and whispered, "It was you." He didn't ask, he stated it as fact, like gravity. I didn't nod, didn't confirm, but I felt something in my chest shift a pressure valve, giving just enough to breathe. Later that day, I sat in the back of the hangar, where I used to run my own diagnostics, away from the noise of clinking coffee mugs, and echoed congratulations Chase was used to. I opened an old file from the Polaris project archive, classified buried under layers of clearance codes. There, it was engine component 741K exhaust housing deviation, detected at 0.02 tolerance breach. If you didn't know where to look, you'd miss it. How most systems did. I remembered the moment I caught it. A Tuesday, rain tapping the hangar roof like code. I was reviewing logs, sipping coffee that had gone cold, and something didn't sit right. The thermal signature was slightly skewed, barely perceptible. I zoomed in, reran the diagnostics. Same result. I opened the panel. There it was. A torque discrepancy. The bolt's integrity is compromised at high altitude. It would have held for maybe another 30 hours of flight. After that, it would have snapped like a twig under a boot. I flagged it, filed a report, not under my name, under my unit. That's how it worked. We weren't people. We were systems, cogs, replaceable, quiet, reliable. I remember walking it over to Lieutenant King, Commander Reeves, who read it in silence and finally muttered, "You're absolutely sure?" I nodded once. "All flight ops depending on this model need to halt until we test every damn one." Another long silence. Then, "Okay, I'll push it up." He didn't thank me, but he didn't ignore me either. Just did what needed to be done. 2 days later, the fleet was grounded for routine diagnostic review. The official report listed automated flag detection triggered by internal system anomaly. There was no mention of me, no footnote, no thanks. That's how it always went. So, when that pilot told his story in the meeting, when he said someone, I felt the ache again. The ache of being almost known, almost seen. That night, I sat in my bunk going through old notes, my own personal logbook where I wrote down every detail the official system didn't hold. Not to prove anything, just to remember, to remind myself I had been there, that I mattered. Caleb came by later, knocked once gently, walked in like he always did, like the silence between us was the kind that understood you. He saw the diagrams on my desk, the notes, the date, the part number. He sat on the floor like when we were kids. "You've been saving people for years," he said, eyes locked on mine. "And no one even knows." I laughed, but it wasn't funny. "That's not why I do it." "I know," he said, but still. We sat there in the dim light, the buzz of base generators in the distance. Then Caleb pulled something from his jacket pocket, a folded printout. He'd found the diagnostic summary from the engine failure week, circled my initials in a system note. Tiny, hidden. "But there, you're not invisible," he said. "They just never learned how to look." He left it on my desk and walked out, and I stared at it for a long time. Because sometimes the name they never say is the one that saves them all. Under the grand ceiling of the gala hall, the chandeliers shimmered like constellations trapped in glass. The room buzzed with polished shoes and perfectly aligned medals, the air thick with perfume, aftershave, and ambition. I sat in the back row, my dress uniform crisp, the silver eagle pins, catching just enough light to remind me who I was, even if the program in my lap said otherwise. Guest of Captain Chase Whitmore. No mention of rank, no mention of the work, just a title I had worn my entire life. Someone else's someone. The MC's voice echoed through the hall, announcing the evening's honoree with all the reverence of a Sunday sermon. Captain Chase Whitmore for distinguished service and leadership in flight operations across multiple deployments, including successful missions under extreme duress. The words swirled around me, a chorus of what I was used to hearing. Everything Chase was everything he'd done. A spotlight slid across the stage, and he stepped into it, with practiced grace, one hand over his heart, the other raised in acknowledgement. The applause was thunderous, predictable. Even Caleb beside me clapped politely at first, though I could feel the tension in his spine. Then it happened. A voice cut through the applause, sharp as a snapped cable. "Excuse me," the pilot said, rising from a table closer to the front. The same young man from the meeting. His voice wavered for a second, then steadied. "Before you continue, there's something I need to say." The MC paused, startled. The room quieted. Fawkes stopped midair. Somewhere near the stage, a general leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "I owe my life to Lieutenant Colonel Emma Whitmore," the pilot said. "She's the reason I'm standing here tonight." Her eyes caught what every system missed. Her cool grounded our squadron before that mission. That wasn't luck. That was her. There was a beat, a pause that felt like the whole room inhaled at once. Then hundreds of heads turned toward the back. Toward me. My name hadn't been in the program. My presence hadn't been announced. And yet, now it rang out louder than every medal pinned to every chest in that room. Chase stood frozen on the stage mouth, slightly open, unsure whether to smile or recoil. I didn't move. I couldn't. I felt every cell in my body vibrating with 20 years of swallowed silence. And then, from my left, I heard the sound of a chair scraping back. Caleb stood. Not hesitantly, not halfway. He rose all the way up, back straight, eyes wet but unwavering. He didn't look at me. He looked forward, and he clapped. Once, twice. Then others joined. First, a woman in uniform from the logistics division. Then someone from ops. A ripple, then a wave. Applause filled the room, not orchestrated, not rehearsed. Real. I stood, not because I knew what to do, but because it felt like the only thing to do. My legs trembled slightly. The pilot stepped down from his table and crossed toward me, stopping a few feet away. He saluted, hand sharp at his brow, his voice low. "Thank you, Mum." I returned the salute. My throat burned. But I didn't cry. Not yet. That came later. For now, I simply nodded. The MC tried to regain control, fumbling with his microphone. Chase cleared his throat, attempting a laugh. "Well, that's my sister, all right. Always making sure I didn't crash and burn." The room chuckled politely, but something had shifted. The spotlight no longer belonged to him. It didn't belong to me either, not fully. It belonged to every quiet worker in a hangar, every unsung name in a footnote, every girl who'd ever been handed a wrench instead of a dream. And Caleb. He stayed standing, even after the clapping stopped. The room didn't breathe. It held its breath like a congregation awaiting judgment. 100 uniforms frozen mid-applause, and in the eye of it all, my mother's hand let go of her water glass. It slipped, hit the table edge and tumbled. The crash wasn't loud, but it was enough. Water-spilled ice skittered like shattered truth across the white linen. Dad shot up from his chair chest, heaving as if he'd been hit in the gut. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at me, not with anger or pride, but something else. A confusion laced with recognition, like he'd just met a version of his daughter he had never made room for. Chase stood stiff behind the podium. A flush spread across his neck. He adjusted the microphone that now didn't feel like his own. I saw the flicker in his eyes, the unravelling of the story he'd grown used to telling. For a split second, he looked like the younger brother, not the star. I walked up the steps, not rushing. Measured, every step was a reclaiming. I wasn't going to the stage for a medal. I was going to speak, to stand where no one had invited me, but where I belonged. I unclipped the mic. My voice was quiet at first, like turning a key in a lock that hadn't been touched in years. But it found its groove. I didn't fly, I said, letting the weight of each word settle, but I kept wings from breaking. No metaphors, no embellishments, just truth, clean and bare. And in that stillness before applause, before realization, there was something heavier than silence. There was recalibration, a shifting of tectonic plates in the room's foundation. People looked around at each other, then at me again, not with pity, but with a dawning understanding. Then one pair of hands clapped. Caleb, loud, clear, defiant. His palms broke the tension like thunder, cracking open the sky. One clap, then another, until the rhythm echoed and multiplied. Someone else stood, then another, until the entire room was on its feet, clapping not for a performance, but for a presence long overdue. I stood there, not smiling, not crying, just being. My throat burned with unshed tears, but I stayed still. The MC stepped back on stage, visibly shaken. He offered a medal, a ceremonial 1-0 official, but it shimmered under the lights like it carried decades. He held it out to me. I took it as not to wear, but to hold. A symbol, not a prize. I turned toward the crowd, scanning for the people who never saw me. My mother's eyes were glossy, her lips parted, but no words came. My father had slumped back into his chair, his hands clasped so tight they'd gone white. Chase. Chase looked away. And that was enough. This, I said, lifting the medal just a bit, is not just for me. It's for every person who's ever kept the sky safe from the ground, who's done their job so well no one noticed. More applause. Not louder, but deeper. From the gut, from the chest. The kind that said, "We see you now." And Caleb still standing, his eyes shone. He mouthed something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. I already knew. We left together, the crowd still buzzing behind us, the echo of applause still trailing our heels like a new kind of gravity. For the first time, I wasn't walking behind my family. I wasn't walking next to silence. I was walking beside someone who'd finally stood up not just for me, but for himself too. We slipped out the side exit of the gala, our medals catching the hallway light, like they were embarrassed to shine too brightly. I didn't say anything. Neither did Caleb. We just walked. In sync as we'd always been, two shadows orbiting the gravity of someone else's spotlight. When we reached the parking lot, I leaned against a pillar and looked up. The night sky stretched above us, clear, vast, indifferent. It reminded me of every time I'd looked up from an airstrip and thought, that's where Chase gets to go. And every time I'd looked down at a torque wrench and told myself, this is where I belong. But something had changed. Tonight, I didn't feel like I belonged underneath anything. Caleb broke the silence first. He didn't finish. He just let it hang in the air like he always did, trusting me to fill in the blanks. I gave a small nod. Yeah, it was. We sat in his car for a while before starting the engine. Windows fogged slightly, breaths misting in sync. You ever think about how many times we swallowed the words we should have said? I asked almost to myself. Caleb exhaled a sad laugh. Too many to count. I turned toward him. Do you remember that science fair in 8th grade? He smiled faintly. The one where I made the water-purifying windmill and you rigged the radio-controlled engine from scrap parts, I nodded. The judges gave me an honourable mention. You didn't place. Caleb looked down. They didn't understand what you'd built. I shrugged. Neither did the family. Mom said it was cute. Dad just asked if Chase had gotten his solo flight badge yet. I paused. That was the first time I realised being brilliant didn't mean being seen. Caleb looked at me then long and steady. You were always more than brilliant, Em. You were brave. In ways I wasn't. I smiled, bitter and grateful at once. You were the only one who sat with me. Sometimes that's braver than speaking. He tapped the steering wheel gently. I almost said something back at your commissioning, when they didn't even come, when you called me instead. His voice was quieter now. I wrote a speech. I tore it up. I blinked. Why? He shrugged. Because back then, I thought love meant not making waves. A beat passed. I don't believe that anymore. Something in my chest unclenched. Not just from tonight, not just from him standing, but from this quiet reckoning between two people who had spent too long making themselves small for the comfort of others. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a pin. Not a military one, this was from my first year on Polaris. A small emblem we made ourselves unofficial but meaningful. I handed it to him. You get this, I said, because you stood. And because all those years when I thought I was alone, you were there. Caleb stared at it, throat working. He didn't say, thank you. He didn't have to. We drove in silence, but it was the kind that healed, not hurt. Back at his place, he walked me to the porch, like we were kids again, walking back from the library with radio wires in our backpacks. Before I went inside, he stopped me. You know, he said what you said tonight, that line about what saves lives never taking off the runway. I looked at him. Yeah, he smiled, tears glistening in his eyes. That saved more than pilots, Em. That saved me too, and with that, I understood the real rank I carried wasn't stitched into my collar. It was etched into the lives I'd touched the people who'd seen me, even when the world refused to look. That was the promotion I'd waited a lifetime for. A month later, I got a message in the family group chat, a rare, almost ceremonial occurrence. Family photo day, it read, sent by my mother, accompanied by a cheerful emoji and a tentative, almost sheepish follow-up. Thought it might be nice to update the one over the fireplace. That fireplace had always been a museum of their pride. Chase front and centre, medals straight jawline sharp, me off to the side, half blocked by a houseplant or a bad crop. Caleb was missing entirely. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then I replied, I'll come. Uniform, okay. The read receipt popped up instantly. Then a pause. Then, yes, please, do. Nothing more. But it was enough. That Saturday, I ironed my dress blues with a care I hadn't felt since my first inspection. Caleb picked me up. We didn't say much, we didn't need to. When we arrived, the air was stiff with politeness, the kind that covers old wounds with new wallpaper. But when the photographer gestured us into position, something happened. Mum said, Emma, why don't you stand in the middle? Dad nodded. You're the highest ranking now? Chase looked away, then back at me. Yeah, he added, voice soft. You should be front and centre. And just like that, the axis tilted. I took my place square in the centre, boots, aligned posture crisp. For the first time, I wasn't part of the frame, I was the frame. The flash clicked and I held still. Not out of duty, but choice. And behind the camera, I saw Caleb smile. The kind of smile that says, this time, we're not pretending. Later at his apartment, I saw it. The photo from the gala, taped to his wall above his desk. I hadn't even known someone had captured that moment, me standing tall, uniform, pristine eyes forward. And beside me, Caleb standing too, a tear frozen mid-fall, a truth finally visible. He'd printed it in black and white. Colour fades, he said, when he noticed me staring. But truth doesn't. He left the room, and I traced the edges of the photo with my fingertips. It didn't need a frame. It already had one memory, loved the silence that had finally broken. They say some battles aren't fought in war zones but in living rooms. I know that now, because the longest war I ever survived was the one where I had to prove I mattered without ever raising my voice. And some victories. They don't end in cheers. They end in peace, in photos that don't cut you out, in brothers who finally see you, in the weight of a name fully said, finally honoured. So if you've ever felt invisible in the place you were supposed to feel, most seen if you've ever held someone else's dream together while yours went unnoticed, this story is for you. You're not alone. And your silence wasn't empty. It was a strength waiting for the right echo. Drop your story in the comments. We're listening. Always have been.